There are people in this world we are taught to trust without question. We teach our children to run toward them when they are afraid. We pull over when they signal us to stop. We open our doors when they knock. The badge, the uniform, the oath, these things carry a weight that goes beyond authority. They carry a promise, a covenant between a person and their community that says, I will protect you. I will not harm you. I am one of the good ones. But what happens when the monster is wearing the uniform? What happens when the person trained to read crime scenes, to understand forensic evidence, to know exactly how an investigation unfolds, uses all of that knowledge not to solve a murder, but to commit one? Today I want to tell you the story of Lyla Porter, 38 years old, state trooper, single mother, a woman who made the mistake of falling in love with the wrong man, and the story of what that man did when her love became inconvenient. This is not an easy story. There is no moment in it where justice arrives quickly or cleanly. There is a little girl who finds something no child should ever find. There is a detective who refused to accept what he was supposed to accept. And there is a man in a uniform who believed, because of his training, because of his position, because of the particular arrogance of people who have spent years on the right side of investigations, that he was untouchable. He was wrong. But it took 18 months and the relentless work of one stubborn detective to prove it. Let's begin with Lyla. Lyla Porter had joined the state police at 24, which in the mid-1990s, for a woman in that department, required a particular kind of quiet toughness. Not the performative kind, the deep, structural kind. The ability to walk into a room and not need it to rearrange itself around you. To do the work without requiring the work to validate you. She had it. Her evaluations over 14 years were consistently excellent. Her colleagues trusted her. The communities she patrolled knew her name. She was, by every professional measure, exactly what a state trooper was supposed to be. Her personal life was a different kind of story. She had married young, at 22, to a man named Thomas Porter, and the marriage had lasted 4 years before it quietly failed under the particular pressures of two people who had grown up faster than they had grown together. The divorce was not acrimonious. It was simply sad and final, and it left Lyla at 26 as the primary parent of a daughter named Emily, who was 2 years old at the time and would grow up watching her mother do everything alone, and do it well. By 2006, Lyla was 36. Emily was 12. The life they had built together was modest but functional. A house in a small town outside the city. Dinner on the table by 7. Lyla's shifts arranged, as much as possible, around Emily's school schedule. It was not a glamorous life. It was a real one, and Lyla had made peace with the reality of it. With the specific solitude of single parenthood, the particular silence of a house where there is only one adult, with the way certain evenings just settle around you with a weight that has no easy name. She was lonely. It is important to say that plainly, without judgment, because loneliness is not a character flaw, and it is not a thing that announces itself. It accumulates, slowly, quietly, in the way that weather accumulates before a storm. And when someone arrives who temporarily lifts that weight, when someone sees you, specifically and warmly, in the middle of a life that has been asking you to be invisible for a very long time, the relief of it can feel almost indistinguishable from love. That someone was Alan Hayes. Alan Hayes was 43 in 2006, a senior supervising officer in the same state police division where Lyla worked. He was the kind of man who fills a room without appearing to try. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy authority of someone who has worn a badge long enough that it no longer feels like something external to him. It simply is him, or so he believed. He was well liked by the officers under his command. He told good stories. He had the particular gift of making people feel, in his presence, that they were slightly more interesting than they thought they were. He was married to a woman named Deborah. They had been together for 17 years. From the outside, from the perspective of the people at the division's annual dinners, from the neighbors who waved from driveways, from anyone who saw them at the kind of events that constitute the visible surface of a marriage, they appeared stable, settled. The kind of couple who had found their equilibrium and were content to remain in it. What Alan Hayes had actually found, after 17 years, was not contentment, but comfort. And he had decided, at some point in the middle years of that marriage, that comfort was insufficient, that he deserved more color, more heat, more of whatever it was that the early years had contained before the dailiness of a long marriage had absorbed it all. He began paying attention to Lyla Porter sometime in late 2005. Not in any dramatic way at first. The specific attentiveness of a senior officer toward a subordinate is easy to camouflage as professional regard. He sought her out in briefings. He asked her opinions on casework in ways that signaled he valued them. He was in her peripheral vision more often than coincidence could account for. And Lyla, who was professional and perceptive, and had spent 14 years navigating a male-dominated environment with her eyes open, noticed. She noticed, and she did not immediately act on it, because she was careful and because she understood the complications involved. But loneliness and careful are not always compatible over time. By early 2006, what had been tension became something else. He made his intentions clear. She did not refuse them. And what began as a single evening that could, in theory, have remained isolated and contained, became instead the beginning of 18 months of an affair that was, in its early stages, everything loneliness had told her was missing from her life. He was attentive in the way that unavailable men often are, intensely present during the time they allocate, deliberately absent otherwise. He called when he said he would call. He appeared when he said he would appear. He said the things that people say when they are conducting a relationship in the compressed, heightened hours available to them. Lyla understood the terms. She was not naive. She did not initially believe that she was the only person in his life, or that the marriage would simply dissolve around the affair like tissue paper and water. She told herself she was clear-eyed about it. But you cannot spend 18 months with someone in the particular intensity of a secret relationship and remain clear-eyed indefinitely. The heart does not compartmentalize as efficiently as the mind intends. What began as something Lyla understood to be temporary and conditional began, slowly and then completely, to feel necessary. She began to imagine a future that extended beyond the stolen hours. She began to resent the boundaries of a situation she had originally accepted. She began to want more. And when Lyla Porter decided she wanted something, she was, as everyone who knew her professionally could have told you, not the kind of woman who waited quietly for it. By the autumn of 2007, the affair had changed in character. The warmth had become volatile. The cause that had once been tender had acquired edges. Lyla had begun to say out loud the things she had previously kept to herself. That she was tired of being invisible. That she was tired of being a secret. That Emily was getting older and Lyla was getting older, and the life she had put on hold for the possibility of a future with Alan was not going to wait indefinitely. She wanted him to leave Deborah. She said it with increasing frequency and decreasing patience. Alan listened. Alan responded with the skilled deflection of a man who had spent decades managing difficult conversations professionally. He was soothing, and then he was firm, and then he was soothing again. He had reasons. He had timelines. He had explanations for why now was not the right moment that, taken individually, sounded reasonable enough, but taken collectively and over months amounted to a single, consistent message. He was not going to leave. What Lyla did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that in October 2007, Deborah Hayes received an inheritance. Deborah's uncle, a man who had never married and had spent 40 years accumulating a modest but real estate fortune in the rural part of the state, died without children and left the bulk of his estate to Deborah. The net value, after estate costs and legal fees, came to approximately $500,000. Have you ever thought about what $500,000 means to a man who has spent his entire adult life as a public employee, drawing a public salary, in a marriage that has always operated at the steady, predictable level of 2 incomes and 1 mortgage and no extraordinary windfalls? $500,000 is not an abstraction. It is a number that rearranges the landscape. It is, depending on what you plan to do next, either a beginning or an ending. For Alan Hayes, it was a trap. Because Deborah's inheritance meant that the financial stakes of divorce had changed completely. In their state, in their circumstances, a divorce proceeding in late 2007 or early 2008 would almost certainly have resulted in the inherited funds being treated as marital property, or at the very minimum, subjected to the kind of lengthy, expensive legal dispute that would consume a substantial portion of what Deborah had received. Alan had consulted, quietly and without Deborah's knowledge, with a private attorney in November 2007. The picture that attorney painted was not one that Alan found acceptable. He stood to lose, in one form or another, a very significant amount of money. And on the other side of this financial calculation stood Lyla Porter, who was no longer making suggestions, but issuing ultimatums. Who had told him, in the last week of January 2008, in terms that were entirely clear and entirely serious, that if he did not tell Deborah the truth about their relationship before the end of February, she would tell Deborah herself. Imagine for a moment the specific dimensions of Alan Hayes' predicament. He is a senior law enforcement officer. He has a reputation. He has a pension. He has a life arranged around the appearance of integrity. On one side of him is a woman who is prepared to dismantle that appearance completely, to call his wife, to put into Deborah's hands whatever evidence she has accumulated, to make everything visible. On the other side is $500,000 that divorce proceedings will consume or complicate or eliminate. And around him, in every direction, is the career he has built and the standing he has cultivated, and the carefully maintained surface of a life that has never had to survive real scrutiny. He was trapped. In the mind of a man who feels trapped, who has spent decades studying criminal psychology, who understands how crimes are investigated and how scenes are read, and what investigators look for and what they accept, that mind begins to move in directions that most people's minds never approach. He began to calculate. The morning of February 9th, 2008 was cold, the kind of cold that settles into a small house overnight and makes the floorboards contract and the windows fog at their edges. Emily Porter was 15 years old. She got up at her usual time, got dressed for school, came downstairs expecting her mother to be in the kitchen, where she always was on Saturday mornings, with coffee and the particular low-grade Saturday calm that was their weekend rhythm. What she found instead will not be described in detail, because Emily Porter is a real person who carried that morning with her for the rest of her life, and some things are not ours to narrate. What I will tell you is that Lyla Porter was found in her kitchen with a single gunshot wound to her chest. Her service weapon, her own state police firearm, was on the floor near her right hand. There was no note. There was no indication in the immediate examination of the scene of forced entry. The initial assessment by the first officers who arrived was that it appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound, a possible suicide. Emily Porter, standing in the hallway of the house she had grown up in, 15 years old, looking at what she was looking at, knew immediately that her mother had not killed herself. She said it to the first officer on the scene. She said it clearly and directly, the way her mother had raised her to speak. No one is sure, in the immediate chaos of that morning, how much weight her words carried with the people who heard them. They carried weight with Detective Garrett Lynch. Lynch had been with the County Homicide Unit for 11 years when he was assigned to the Porter case. He was in his mid-40s, methodical in a way that some of his colleagues read as slow and others read as thorough, and he had spent 11 years developing a finely calibrated instinct for the difference between a scene that tells a true story and a scene that has been arranged to tell a particular one. He arrived at Lyla's house within 2 hours of Emily's call. He walked through the kitchen 3 times before he said anything to anyone. He looked at the position of the body, at the angle of the wound, at the location of the weapon. He looked at the specific stillness of the scene, the stillness of something that had been placed, not fallen. Garrett Lynch did not believe it was a suicide. He believed it immediately and completely, with the specific certainty that experienced investigators sometimes develop in the first minutes of a scene, the conviction that precedes the evidence and is later either confirmed or dismantled by it. In this case, it was confirmed. The forensic analysis of the weapon in the days that followed identified two problems immediately. The first was the angle of the entry wound, which was inconsistent with a self-inflicted shot from the position suggested by the weapon's placement. A forensic pathologist brought in to review the findings was direct in her conclusion. The wound was not self-inflicted. The geometry was wrong. The physics did not support the narrative the scene was presenting. The second problem was the weapon itself. Lyla Porter's service firearm had been handled, cleaned or partially cleaned, in a way that was inconsistent with the scene. A weapon used in a self-inflicted shooting carries specific trace evidence in specific distributions. This one did not. The patterns were wrong. Something had been done to the gun after the shooting and before the scene was found. Lynch requested access to Lyla's personal effects, her phone records, and her email accounts. It took several days and the appropriate warrants to obtain the email access. What the email archive contained stopped the investigation in its tracks. 18 months of correspondence between Lyla Porter and Alan Hayes. The emails were explicit about the relationship, about its duration, about the pressure Lyla had been applying in the final months. There were emails from Lyla detailing her ultimatum. There were emails from Alan that, read in the cold context of a murder investigation, contained a particular register of desperation that had not been apparent to Lyla when she received them, but was unmistakable now. There was, in the final week of January 2008, a series of exchanges in which the temperature of the correspondence changed in a way that Lynch and his team spent considerable time analyzing. Alan Hayes was brought in for questioning within 2 weeks of the discovery of the email archive. He was represented by an attorney from the first interview. He denied the affair initially, then acknowledged it when presented with the emails, then denied any involvement in Lyla's death with a composure that Lynch later described as the most unsettling thing he had encountered in 11 years of homicide work, the particular calm of a man who believed he had done something that could not be proven. The forensic evidence said otherwise. Gunpowder residue testing, conducted on the jacket Alan Hayes had been wearing on the morning of February 9th, which had been collected as part of a broader evidence request, returned a positive result. The distribution of residue was consistent with proximity to a fired weapon at close range. The jacket had been laundered, but not thoroughly enough. Trace evidence does not always yield to a single wash cycle. And then there were the fingerprints. A partial fingerprint recovered from the underside of the barrel of Lyla's service weapon, a location that would not have been touched in the ordinary course of using or cleaning the weapon, but might have been touched by someone repositioning it, placing it deliberately near a body, matched Alan Hayes. His attorneys challenged the match immediately and aggressively. An independent expert hired by the defense found the partial print inconclusive. The prosecution's expert maintained the identification. It became one of the central disputes of the trial. But it was not the only evidence, and the totality of what Garrett Lynch had assembled, the angle of the wound, the handled weapon, the residue on the jacket, the financial motive, the emails, the timeline, the fact that Alan Hayes could not produce a verifiable account of his whereabouts for the critical window on the morning of February 9th, formed a structure that the defense found very difficult to dismantle completely. There was a period during the investigation, lasting several months, when the question of Deborah Hayes' involvement became a secondary focus. She had known, investigators believed, about the affair at some point before Lyla's death, or had suspected it. There were phone records suggesting calls between Alan and Deborah in the week before February 9th that were longer than usual and occurred at unusual hours. There were people who came forward during the investigation to say that Deborah had made comments, in the months preceding the murder, that suggested awareness of the situation. The defense, when the case went to trial in the summer of 2009, attempted to use this ambiguity aggressively, to redirect the jury's attention toward Deborah as an alternative suspect, a wronged wife who had discovered her husband's affair and the threat Lyla represented to her inherited fortune. It was a credible enough strategy on paper. In the courtroom, it did not survive the forensic evidence. Because the residue was on Alan's jacket, because the partial print was on Alan's weapon, Lyla's weapon, handled by Alan, because Alan had no alibi, because the financial motive, $500,000 that a divorce proceeding would have consumed or reduced drastically, attached specifically to Alan, not to Deborah, who would have kept her inheritance intact in any divorce. Because the emails showed Alan's desperation, not Deborah's. Because a forensic psychologist called by the prosecution walked the jury through the systematic nature of the scene staging. The weapon placement, the partial cleaning, the absence of forced entry, all of it consistent with someone who understood exactly how suicide scenes were supposed to look, who had studied them professionally for decades, and who had attempted to replicate one imperfectly. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On August 14, 2009, Alan Hayes was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has maintained his innocence in every subsequent statement and filing. The appeals process has, at each stage, declined to overturn the verdict. The evidence, assembled by a detective who did not believe the first story the scene told him and refused to accept it until the evidence told him otherwise, has held. Deborah Hayes was never charged. The investigation ultimately found insufficient evidence to establish her as a knowing participant in the murder. She gave a statement to the press following the verdict that was brief and careful and said very little. She has not spoken publicly about the case since. Emily Porter was 15 when she found her mother. She gave testimony at trial with a steadiness that the courtroom reportedly found difficult to watch. Not because she was emotional, but because she was not, in the way of someone who has used up a particular kind of feeling and is operating now from something deeper and harder. She spoke about her mother clearly and without ornamentation. She described the morning of February 9th in precise, sequential language. She did not look at Alan Hayes while she spoke. Garrett Lynch retired from the homicide unit in 2016. In an interview given the year before his retirement, he was asked which cases stayed with him. He mentioned Lyla Porter's case without hesitation, and then was quiet for a long moment, before he said that the thing that had kept him on it, in the early weeks when the pressure to accept the suicide conclusion was real, was Emily Porter's voice on the morning of the discovery. The certainty in it. The 15-year-old girl who knew, immediately and completely, that what she was being presented with was not the truth. He said he thought about that a lot, about what it means to be believed when you say that something is wrong, about how much depends, in this world, on whether the person who hears you decides to keep listening. I think about that too. Lyla Porter was 38 years old. She was a state trooper for 14 years. She raised her daughter alone, and she did it well. And she was lonely in the way that anyone is lonely who has given most of themselves to work and parenthood and has very little left for anything else. She made one catastrophic mistake. Not a moral one, but a practical one. She trusted the wrong man with the knowledge of how much he stood to lose. She believed that love, or something close to it, would be stronger than money. She was wrong, and she paid for being wrong in the most permanent way possible. Alan Hayes calculated the cost of her silence against the cost of her continuing to speak, and he made the decision that a certain kind of man makes when he has convinced himself that his preservation is worth more than another person's life. He used everything he knew, everything the state had trained him to know, to try to make a murder disappear inside the appearance of a suicide. He was methodical, he was cold, and he was not quite good enough, because the scene he constructed contained the small imperfections that a careful detective noticed on a cold February morning when he walked through a kitchen 3 times and trusted what the evidence was beginning, slowly, to tell him. Have you ever wondered what greed can do to a man's soul? Not sudden greed, the sharp, obvious kind, but the slow variety, the kind that builds itself quietly in the gap between what a person has and what they believe they deserve. Alan Hayes did not wake up one morning as a murderer. He became one incrementally, over months, as each calculation led to the next one, each justification making the following one feel more accessible, until the distance between who he had presented himself as and what he was capable of had closed completely, and all that remained was the decision. A badge carries a promise. We teach our children that. We build institutions around that premise, entire systems of public trust that rest on the assumption that the people who carry those badges have, at the center of themselves, something worth trusting. Lyla Porter had that thing. She carried it for 14 years, through difficult shifts and a difficult divorce, and the long, quiet difficulty of building a life as a single parent in a job that does not leave much room for softness. She earned that badge every day she wore it. Alan Hayes wore the same badge. He swore the same oath. And when the moment came that tested what was actually at the center of him, what the badge and the oath and the uniform had been covering all those years, it was not what it was supposed to be. It never is with this kind of man. The tragedy is that by the time you find out, it is always too late. Emily Porter was 15 years old. She knew her mother. She said clearly on the morning of February 9th, 2008, that what she was looking at was not what it was supposed to appear to be. She was right. And it took 18 months and one stubborn detective and the imperfect forensic traces of a crime that its perpetrator believed he had committed flawlessly to prove it. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not fast and it was not clean, and it did not give Emily Porter her mother back. But it came. And sometimes, in these stories, that is the only thing left to hold on to.